Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is Why Medieval People Had Less Stress. You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Why medieval people had less stress. The church bell rang long before the sun climbed above the hills. Its slow, familiar sound drifted across the valley, touching every cottage, every stable, every sleeping soul. No alarms screamed from a glowing phone. No endless stream of notifications demanded attention before a person's feet even touched the floor. The bell was enough. It had been enough for generations. A young farmer named Thomas opened his eyes. The tiny room was cold. A faint orange light slipped through the cracks in the wooden shutters, mixing with the smell of burning oak from the hearth below. His wife still slept beside him, while their youngest child quietly breathed beneath a wool blanket stitched by hand during the previous winter. Thomas did not wonder what thousands of strangers were doing. He did not compare his life with wealthy nobles living hundreds of miles away. He did not begin the morning feeling late before the day had even started. Instead, he listened. The wind pushed softly against the thatched roof. A rooster crowed from somewhere beyond the barn. One cow shifted its weight, its chain gently clinking against old timber. Everything sounded exactly as it had yesterday, and strangely, that was comforting. Today would probably look very similar to yesterday. Tomorrow would probably resemble today. To someone living in the 21st century, that might sound unbearably boring. To Thomas, it meant safety. Predictability was one of the greatest luxuries a medieval villager could possess. Modern people often imagine the Middle Ages as one endless nightmare. Mud, disease, war, famine, cruel kings, brutal punishments. Those things certainly existed. Life expectancy was shorter. Medicine was primitive. Even a simple infection could become deadly. Yet historians have noticed something fascinating when studying medieval society. Although medieval people endured hardships that would terrify us today, many of the psychological pressures that dominate modern life simply did not exist. No emails arrived at midnight. No employer expected 24-hour availability. No social media convinced people they were failures because someone else owned a larger house. No endless advertisements whispered every minute that happiness could only be purchased. Stress certainly existed. But stress is not always the same thing as anxiety. Fear is not identical to constant mental overload. A farmer worrying about whether rain would arrive before harvest experienced a different kind of burden than a modern office worker juggling deadlines, debt, traffic, digital distractions, and thousands of tiny decisions every single day. The human brain evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. For almost all of that time, it processed information slowly. Faces, voices, weather, animals, seasons, nearby dangers. Suddenly, within only a few generations, that same brain found itself drowning inside an ocean of information. Every headline competes for attention. Every app demands another glance. Every platform insists that someone else's life is somehow better than our own. Perhaps the greatest surprise is not that modern people feel overwhelmed. Perhaps the surprise is that we expect ourselves not to. The Middle Ages force us to ask an uncomfortable question. What if progress solved many problems while quietly creating entirely new ones? Imagine standing inside an English village sometime around the year 1280. No engines, no electric lights, no airplanes crossing the sky. The loudest sound is usually livestock. The tallest building is probably the church. Everyone knows everyone else. Everyone knows your parents. Your grandparents probably lived in the same village. Your children will likely remain there too. The world feels incredibly small. That smallness creates limitations, but it also creates psychological stability. Modern society celebrates unlimited choice. Choose your career, choose your city, choose your identity, choose among thousands of products, choose what to watch, choose what to eat, choose what to wear, choose your future. Choice sounds like freedom. Yet psychologists have repeatedly found that too much choice often produces exhaustion. Every decision consumes mental energy. Every alternative creates doubt. Did I choose correctly? Could I have done better? What did I miss? Thomas never spent 40 minutes deciding which loaf of bread to buy. There was bread, or there wasn't. He wore clothing made from materials available nearby. He ate food grown within walking distance. His expectations were shaped not by celebrities, but by neighbors whose lives looked remarkably similar to his own. Comparison existed. Jealousy existed. Human nature has never changed, but comparison had limits. A peasant could envy another farmer's healthier ox. He rarely spent hours staring at kings displaying unimaginable wealth every evening before bed. Modern technology allows us to compare ourselves with millions of people instantly. Our ancestors mostly compared themselves with perhaps 100 familiar faces. That difference matters far more than many people realize. None of this means medieval life was easy. Far from it. If drought destroyed the harvest, hunger followed. If disease entered a village, entire families disappeared. If soldiers marched nearby, terror spread faster than smoke. The Middle Ages were filled with uncertainty. Yet uncertainty often arrived in large waves, separated by long periods of ordinary routine. Modern uncertainty rarely leaves. It hums quietly inside our pockets. Every notification promises new information. Every headline announces another crisis. Every vibration interrupts a thought before it can fully form. Our ancestors rarely experienced uninterrupted streams of alarming news from distant places they could never influence. If something terrible happened hundreds of miles away, they might never hear about it. Ignorance was not always dangerous. Sometimes it was peaceful. As the first rays of sunlight reached Thomas's doorway, he stepped outside. Morning mist floated above green fields. His neighbor was already repairing a wooden fence. Neither man needed to schedule a meeting. Neither needed to send a message. Without speaking, they nodded. They had known each other since childhood. Trust had grown slowly over decades, rather than through usernames and profile pictures. The village itself functioned almost like one enormous family. People argued. They gossiped. They held grudges. But they also shared tools, helped during harvest, rebuilt damaged roofs, watched one another's children, cared for elderly neighbors. No government program instructed them to do so. Survival required cooperation. Isolation was dangerous. Community was essential. Ironically, many people today possess thousands of online connections while feeling deeply alone. Thomas owned almost nothing compared with a modern household. No refrigerator, no television, no automobile, no computer, no savings account, no insurance policy. Yet every object surrounding him carried meaning, because nearly everything required immense effort to produce. A wooden spoon represented hours of carving. A wool cloak represented months of labor. A loaf of bread represented an entire growing season. Scarcity often creates appreciation. Abundance sometimes creates indifference. Modern life constantly encourages dissatisfaction. A newer phone, a larger home, a faster car, a better vacation, a more successful career. The finish line keeps moving. Thomas rarely imagined becoming someone completely different. He hoped for healthy crops, healthy children, reasonable weather, enough food to survive winter. His ambitions were modest because the world around him made modest ambitions seem perfectly respectable. That alone removed countless invisible pressures modern people carry every day. Of course, medieval villagers also feared things we hardly think about anymore. Hell, divine judgment, crop failure, plague, child mortality. Those fears were real, very real, but they existed inside a shared worldview. Religion offered explanations. Tradition offered routines. Communities offered support. Whether those explanations were scientifically correct is a different question. Psychologically, they gave suffering meaning. Humans tolerate hardship far better when hardship appears understandable. Perhaps that is one of history's greatest lessons. Pain becomes heavier when it feels meaningless. As Thomas picked up his worn wooden hoe and walked toward the fields, he did not realize that people living hundreds of years in the future would possess machines capable of crossing oceans in hours, speaking instantly across continents, curing diseases once thought impossible, and carrying the entire world's knowledge inside a pocket. Nor could he imagine that those same people would often struggle to sleep, would battle anxiety, would feel isolated inside crowded cities, would constantly feel behind. History rarely moves in one direction. Every gain brings new challenges. Every solution creates unexpected consequences. The Middle Ages were not an age without suffering, but perhaps they were an age that understood something modern civilization has slowly forgotten: that the human mind was never designed to run at full speed every waking moment. And that is where our journey truly begins. The morning that never rushed. Thomas had never heard the phrase, "I'm too busy," not because he had nothing to do, quite the opposite. His life was filled with work from sunrise until darkness covered the fields. There were fences to repair, chickens to feed, tools to sharpen, weeds to pull, and soil to prepare before the next planting season. Every day demanded effort, and every season brought a different list of responsibilities. Yet there was a remarkable difference between being busy and feeling constantly rushed. The modern world often confuses the two. Thomas worked because the earth required it. He did not work because a calendar reminded him of 12 meetings, 3 deadlines, 50 unread messages, and a growing list of unfinished tasks. His work followed nature's clock, not an artificial one. As he walked along the narrow dirt path leading toward the fields, the morning air carried the scent of damp soil and wild flowers. Dew clung to every blade of grass, sparkling beneath the first rays of sunlight. Birds sang from the nearby oak trees, completely unaware that centuries later, scientists would discover how birdsong can reduce stress hormones in the human body. Thomas did not need science to tell him that mornings felt peaceful. He simply experienced them. The village slowly awakened around him. Smoke curled gently from stone chimneys. A blacksmith opened the heavy wooden doors of his workshop. Children carried buckets toward the village well while laughing over some small joke that would be forgotten before lunchtime. An elderly woman swept the front of her cottage with slow, practiced movements. No one hurried, not because life was easy, because rushing rarely changed anything. A field could not be forced to grow faster. A tree would not bear fruit before its season. Rain would arrive when it arrived. Winter would come whether people worried about it or not. Nature taught patience every single day. Modern civilization teaches control. We believe enough planning can eliminate uncertainty. Enough effort can conquer every obstacle. Enough productivity can create the perfect life. When reality refuses to cooperate, frustration quickly follows. Medieval people certainly planned ahead. They stored grain. They repaired roofs before winter. They salted meat. They collected firewood. But they also accepted that much of life rested beyond human control. Storms ignored schedules. Diseases ignored social status. Harvests ignored personal ambition. This acceptance was not weakness. In many ways, it was emotional resilience. Historians sometimes describe medieval life as deeply connected to the rhythm of the seasons. That phrase sounds poetic, but for people like Thomas, it was simply reality. Spring meant planting. Summer meant endless hours beneath the sun. Autumn meant harvest. Winter meant repair, storytelling, prayer, and waiting. Each season carried its own purpose. Modern life, by comparison, often feels exactly the same in January as it does in July. Offices remain brightly lit. Emails continue arriving. Deadlines never stop. Artificial light allows work to continue long after sunset. The seasons still exist. Many people simply stop noticing them. Thomas paused beside a shallow stream before entering the fields. The water flowed quietly over smooth stones polished by centuries of movement. He knelt, splashed cold water across his face, and took a long drink. There was no expensive morning routine, no productivity podcast, no motivational speaker insisting he must become the best version of himself before breakfast. He simply stood there for a moment, watching the current, listening to the breeze moving through tall reeds, feeling awake. Today, psychologists might describe this as mindfulness. Thomas would have laughed if someone suggested he was practicing a mental exercise. He wasn't practicing anything. He was simply present. Human beings have always possessed the ability to notice the world around them. Modern technology often pulls that attention elsewhere. As Thomas reached the edge of his family's field, he found his father already inspecting the young barley. The old man's beard had turned almost completely white. Deep wrinkles marked years spent beneath sun, wind, and rain. Without saying much, the two men began working side by side. Conversation came naturally. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they remained silent for nearly an hour. Neither silence nor speech felt uncomfortable. Today, silence often makes people uneasy. A quiet room quickly fills with phones, music, videos, or notifications. Many people have forgotten that silence itself can be restful. For Thomas, silence was never empty. It was filled with birds, wind, insects, flowing water, the distant sound of an axe striking wood, the occasional laughter drifting from another field. Nature rarely becomes completely silent. It simply speaks more softly than modern machines, As the morning continued, neighboring farmers gradually appeared across the landscape. Each family worked its own land, yet everyone remained close enough to help if trouble appeared. One broken wagon could delay an entire harvest. A sick neighbor might need assistance gathering crops before heavy rain. Success was rarely achieved alone. Community was not merely a pleasant idea. It was survival itself. This constant human connection shaped emotional health in ways researchers continue to study today. Loneliness certainly existed during the Middle Ages. Widows experienced it. Travelers experienced it. Hermits even chose it. But ordinary village life rarely left people completely isolated. Someone always knocked at the door. Someone always passed along the road. Someone always needed help repairing a fence, baking bread, or bringing in firewood before nightfall. Modern people often enjoy greater privacy than any generation in history. Yet that same privacy sometimes transforms into loneliness without warning. By midday, sweat covered Thomas's forehead. His hands ached. His back protested each movement. The work was undeniably hard. But hard work and mental exhaustion are not always the same thing. Many people today finish an office shift physically comfortable yet mentally drained beyond words. Thomas often experienced the opposite. His body grew tired. His mind remained surprisingly calm. Why? Because every action had an immediate purpose: pull weeds, protect the crop, repair the fence, feed the animals. The results were visible. Progress could be touched with his own hands. Modern work often feels abstract. A person may spend 8 hours answering emails, updating spreadsheets, attending virtual meetings, and still wonder what they truly accomplished. The human brain enjoys completing visible tasks. Our ancestors experienced that satisfaction almost daily. Around noon, Thomas and his father rested beneath the shade of a great oak tree. His wife arrived carrying coarse bread, soft cheese, onions, and a small jug of weak ale. The meal was simple. Very simple. Yet no one complained. There was no endless menu, no difficult decision, no scrolling through dozens of restaurant reviews. The food served one purpose: to nourish, nothing more. After eating, nobody immediately rushed back to work. For several quiet minutes, they simply sat together, watching clouds drift slowly overhead, listening to distant sheep, feeling the gentle warmth of the afternoon sun. Those few moments may seem insignificant, but countless small pauses throughout the day helped shape medieval life. Modern schedules often eliminate pauses entirely. One task blends into the next until evening arrives almost unnoticed. Then another screen waits before bedtime. The brain never fully slows down. Thomas eventually stood, stretched his aching shoulders, picked up his hoe once again, and returned to the field. The work continued. Steady, predictable, honest. Each swing of the tool carried a rhythm older than kingdoms themselves. He had no idea that centuries later, millions of people would wake every morning already exhausted, not because they had worked too hard, but because their minds had never truly rested. The greatest burden many modern people carry cannot be seen. It lives inside endless thoughts. Endless choices, endless comparisons, endless urgency. Thomas carried sacks of grain. Modern people often carry invisible weight. And sometimes invisible weight is the heaviest burden of all. A world. Small enough to understand. By the time the afternoon sun stood high above the village, Thomas had already forgotten what day of the month it was. Not because he lacked intelligence, because it simply didn't matter. He knew it was late spring. He knew the barley was growing well. He knew the weather had remained kind for nearly a week, and he knew there were still several days before the neighboring village held its market. That was enough. The modern world measures life in minutes. The medieval world measured life in seasons. Today, many people schedule their lives months in advance. Meetings are booked weeks before they happen. Phones remind us of birthdays, appointments, bills, deadlines, anniversaries, and even when to drink water. Thomas needed none of those things. The rhythm of life lived inside memory rather than inside a calendar. When the swallows returned, spring had arrived. When the wheat turned golden, harvest was near. When leaves covered the roads, winter preparations began. Nature itself served as the village's calendar. Every tree, every flower, every bird, every change in the sky quietly reminded people what came next. It wasn't perfect, but it gave life a rhythm that humans had followed for thousands of years. As Thomas worked, another farmer approached from across the field. It was William, a man only a few years older than Thomas. His boots were caked with mud, and his linen shirt was dark with sweat. He carried a wooden rake across one shoulder and smiled before speaking. "Looks like we'll have rain tomorrow." Thomas looked toward the western horizon. A line of gray clouds rested above the distant hills. "I think you're right." That was the entire conversation. No debates about politics, no endless discussions about people they had never met, no breaking news from another continent. Most conversations centered around the things people could actually influence. The weather, the crops, their families, the livestock, the coming feast day, the broken fence that still needed repairing. It may sound like a narrow world. In many ways it was. But it was also a world that fit comfortably inside the human mind. Today, a single person can wake up and learn about earthquakes in Asia, elections in Europe, wildfires in North America, financial markets in Tokyo, celebrity scandals in Los Angeles, and conflicts in places they may never visit. The human brain processes all of this as information requiring attention. Yet most of it remains completely beyond individual control. Historians often point out that medieval villagers knew surprisingly little about distant kingdoms. A farmer living in England might never learn the name of a king ruling Hungary. A blacksmith in France might never hear about events unfolding in Scandinavia. That lack of information is often viewed as ignorance. Sometimes it was. But it also protected people from carrying the emotional weight of countless events they could do nothing about. Thomas worried about the field before him, not the entire world. As afternoon drifted onward, a group of children ran laughing across the edge of the meadow. They chased one another with sticks, pretending they were brave knights defending an imaginary castle. One little girl carried a crown woven from wildflowers. A younger boy stumbled into the grass before bursting into laughter. No parent shouted from a distance to be careful every few seconds. No one checked where they were through a mobile phone. The children knew the boundaries of the village. Everyone else knew them too. If one child wandered too far, another adult would notice long before danger appeared. In many medieval villages, children belonged not only to their parents, but, in a sense, to the entire community. Every grandmother watched them. Every shepherd recognized them. Every neighbor knew whose son or daughter they were. That constant web of familiarity created something modern psychologists call social security. Not financial security, but emotional security. You were known. People recognized your face. Your absence would be noticed. Today, millions of people live surrounded by strangers. Some have gone years without learning the names of those living next door. Cities offer opportunity, but they can also quietly erase the feeling of belonging. Thomas remembered every family in the village. He knew who had recently lost a child. He knew whose cow had fallen ill. He knew which widow needed help gathering firewood before winter. The entire village carried one another's stories. Modern life often gives us access to millions of strangers while leaving us disconnected from the people living only a few meters away. As the afternoon heat intensified, Thomas paused to wipe sweat from his forehead. He looked across the valley. Fields stretched like great green blankets beneath the sky. Beyond them stood dense forests where deer wandered unseen. Further still rose gentle hills, fading into blue. That was the edge of his world. Everything beyond those hills existed almost like another universe. Travel was difficult, expensive, sometimes dangerous. Most medieval people never journeyed more than a few dozen miles from the place where they were born. Modern readers often feel sympathy when hearing that. How tragic, they think. How limiting. Perhaps. Yet there is another way to see it. When your entire world fits within a day's walk, it becomes deeply familiar. Every tree carries memories. Every road reminds you of someone. Every hill has a story. The landscape itself becomes part of your identity. Today, many people move several times during their lives. They change cities, jobs, countries, friends, entire communities. Mobility brings freedom, but it also demands constant adaptation. The medieval villager rarely had to reinvent himself. His roots reached deep into the same soil his ancestors had worked for generations. As the sun slowly began its descent, Thomas heard church bells once again. This time they rang softly across the valley, reminding the villagers that evening prayers would soon begin. No one checked the time, no one needed a clock. The bells were enough. Sound united the village. Everyone heard the same signal at the same moment. Work gradually slowed. Farmers lifted tools onto their shoulders. Women gathered laundry drying outside. Children abandoned their games and hurried home before supper. Even the animals seemed to recognize the changing light. Geese wandered toward their pens. Sheep clustered together. Dogs stretched lazily after sleeping through the warmest hours of the day. Everything moved with the rhythm of nature, not with urgency, but with purpose. As Thomas started walking home, he passed the village well. Several women stood nearby filling wooden buckets while exchanging stories about the day's work. One laughed so loudly that even birds flew from a nearby hedge. Another woman teased her brother for nearly falling into the stream that morning. The conversation flowed easily. No one seemed in a hurry to end it. These ordinary moments mattered more than people realized. Laughter shared face to face. Small conversations without distractions. Neighbors meeting naturally during daily tasks instead of arranging them weeks in advance. Modern research consistently shows that strong social bonds reduce stress and improve mental well-being. Medieval villagers didn't know the science. They simply lived it. Their lives were woven together by necessity, not convenience, not technology, necessity. Thomas reached his cottage just as the first cool breeze of evening swept across the fields. The smoke rising from the chimney carried the comforting smell of vegetable stew. His youngest son came running toward him, wrapping small arms around his father's waist. Thomas smiled, lifted the boy into the air, and for a brief moment forgot every aching muscle in his body. There would still be work tomorrow. There always was. But tomorrow could wait until tomorrow. That simple habit, the ability to leave tomorrow where it belonged, may have been one of the greatest gifts medieval people possessed. A gift that many centuries later, in a world of endless planning and constant connection, would become surprisingly rare. When the sun went down, so did the work. Thomas pushed open the heavy wooden door of his cottage just as the last golden rays of sunlight slipped behind the distant hills. The familiar warmth of the hearth welcomed him before anyone spoke a word. His wife, Margaret, stirred a pot hanging above the fire. Steam rose slowly into the dim room, carrying the comforting smell of onions, cabbage, herbs, and a small piece of salted pork that had been carefully saved for the evening meal. Their oldest daughter sat near the fire spinning wool with patient hands. The youngest boy played on the floor, carving tiny marks into a scrap of wood with a blunt knife under his grandfather's careful eye. No one stared at a glowing screen. No one wore headphones. No one sat together while living in separate digital worlds. The family occupied the same room, sharing the same silence. That silence wasn't awkward, and it was peaceful. Modern evenings often begin when work officially ends, but work rarely stays behind. Emails continue arriving. Messages demand replies. Deadlines remain unfinished. Many people carry their jobs home without realizing it. Their bodies leave the office, their minds do not. Thomas had no such burden. Once he crossed the doorway of his cottage, the field remained outside. Tomorrow's work belonged to tomorrow. His mind could finally rest. That separation between labor and home existed naturally in medieval life. Today, technology has erased many of those boundaries. The office fits inside a pocket. A single notification can instantly pull someone back into work while eating dinner with family. Historians sometimes describe medieval villages as places where work and family existed side by side. A blacksmith's children watched iron being shaped. A baker's family smelled fresh bread every morning. A carpenter's son learned by watching his father long before he ever held a tool himself. Skills were not hidden behind classroom walls. They were woven into daily life. Thomas's children already understood farming better than many adults in modern cities, not because they attended lessons, because they lived them every day. As the stew finished cooking, Margaret placed rough wooden bowls onto the table. There were no elaborate recipes, no expensive spices brought from distant lands. Most meals looked remarkably similar from one day to the next. Some might consider that dull. Yet simplicity often removes unnecessary decisions. Modern psychologists sometimes speak of decision fatigue, the mental exhaustion that comes from making countless choices throughout the day. Which clothes should I wear? What should I eat? Which route should I drive? Which streaming service should I watch? Which message deserves an immediate reply? Every decision quietly drains attention. Thomas faced very few unnecessary choices. His clothing had already been laid out. His meal was whatever the household had prepared. His entertainment would come naturally from conversation. Far fewer decisions meant far less mental clutter. The family gathered around the small wooden table. Before eating, Thomas quietly bowed his head. Everyone else followed. The prayer lasted less than a minute. Simple words of gratitude. Thanks for the harvest. Thanks for the meal. Thanks for another day. Whether one shares the same beliefs or not, historians agree that faith gave medieval people a powerful framework for understanding life. When tragedy struck, suffering rarely appeared random. It existed within a story larger than themselves. Modern society has gained incredible scientific knowledge, yet many people still struggle with one timeless question. Why do difficult things happen? Thomas believed he already knew. That belief did not remove pain, but it often softened confusion. After supper, the bowls were cleaned and placed back upon the shelf. No one rushed away. There was nowhere else to be. Outside, darkness slowly settled across the valley. Without electricity, night transformed the entire rhythm of human life. Candles were valuable. Firewood required effort. People naturally became quieter after sunset. The world itself encouraged rest. Today, artificial light allows activity 24 hours a day. Cities shine brighter than stars. Many people sleep fewer hours than their ancestors, even though their lives demand constant concentration. The medieval night reminded everyone that the day had ended. Nature itself announced closing time. Thomas stepped outside. The evening air felt cooler now. Crickets filled the silence with their steady song. Above him, the sky stretched farther than words could describe. Thousands upon thousands of stars burned across the darkness. Without electric lights, the heavens appeared astonishingly bright. The Milky Way arched across the sky like a silver river. Thomas often looked upward after long days in the fields. He didn't know the names astronomers would one day give those distant stars. He didn't understand galaxies or light years. He simply felt something many modern people rarely experience. Wonder. Pure, uncomplicated wonder. There is something deeply calming about realizing how small one person truly is beneath an endless sky. Modern life constantly reminds us that everything depends upon us. Our career, our finances, our reputation, our productivity, our future. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels personal. Standing beneath a sky filled with countless stars quietly suggests another truth. The universe existed long before us. It will continue long after us. Perhaps not every burden needs to be carried alone. As Thomas watched the stars, his neighbor William approached carrying a small wooden lantern. "Mind if I join you?" Thomas smiled. "Of course." The two men sat upon a fallen log outside the cottage. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, William laughed. "My youngest chased 3 chickens today." Thomas chuckled. Did he catch one? He caught the mud. Both men laughed together. Their conversation wandered naturally. The coming rain, the church festival next month, a fox seen near the sheep pasture, a broken wagon wheel, nothing extraordinary. Yet these ordinary conversations strengthened friendships year after year. Modern communication has become incredibly fast. But speed does not always create closeness. 100 messages cannot always replace an hour spent sitting beside another person. As the fireflies appeared above the nearby grass, William eventually stood. "Tomorrow will come early." "It always does," Thomas replied. William disappeared into the darkness, carrying only the soft glow of his lantern. Thomas remained outside a little longer. The village had grown quiet. Only distant dogs barked from somewhere across the valley. Inside the cottage, his children were already asleep. tomorrow would bring more work, more sweat, more aching muscles, perhaps even rain. Yet none of it disturbed him tonight. Because tonight belonged to rest. Modern society often celebrates those who never stop working, those who answer messages at midnight, those who sacrifice sleep for productivity. The medieval world understood something far older. Even the strongest horse cannot pull a cart forever without stopping. Even the richest soil must lie fallow from time to time. Even the human heart needs moments of stillness. Thomas took one final look at the stars before quietly returning inside. The wooden door closed behind him. The fire burned low. The cottage settled into silence. Outside, the village slept. Not because there was nothing left to do, but because another day would always come with the sunrise. And for medieval people, that was enough. Little did Thomas know that centuries later, millions of people would lie awake in warm beds, surrounded by every modern comfort imaginable, yet unable to quiet their racing minds. Perhaps the greatest luxury was never wealth. Perhaps it was the simple ability to end the day, and truly let it end. The power of knowing your place. The next morning arrived just as quietly as the one before. Before the first rays of the sunlight touched the rooftops, the church bell echoed across the valley once again. It rolled gently over the fields, across the river, and into every cottage. No one reached for a snooze button. No one stared at a glowing screen before opening their eyes. Thomas woke because the world around him was waking. Outside, a light mist floated above the grass. The village still rested beneath a blanket of pale gray, and only the sounds of birds hinted that another day had begun. As he dressed, he noticed his father already sitting beside the fire, carefully repairing the leather strap of an old farming tool. The old man had performed similar tasks every morning for as long as Thomas could remember. There was comfort in that routine. Some people believe routine makes life dull. History often suggests the opposite. Routine gives the human mind something precious, predictability. Modern psychologists have found that uncertainty is one of the greatest sources of stress. When people cannot predict what comes next, the brain stays alert, preparing for possible danger. For medieval villagers, life contained many uncertainties. Harvests could fail. Storms could destroy crops. Disease could arrive without warning. But the structure of daily life rarely changed. Morning prayers, field work, midday meal, evening chores, family supper, rest. Tomorrow would likely follow the same pattern. That rhythm became an invisible source of emotional stability. Thomas stepped outside carrying a wooden bucket toward the village well. Along the narrow path, he greeted nearly everyone he met. Old Robert, whose knees had grown too weak for heavy farming, nodded from his doorway. Young Alice hurried toward the baker's oven carrying a basket of dough. The village priest slowly crossed the square with a small book tucked beneath his arm. Every face was familiar. Every name carried years of shared memories. In the modern world, many people spend entire days surrounded by strangers. Crowded trains, busy offices, shopping centers filled with unfamiliar faces. Yet despite constant contact with people, genuine familiarity has become surprisingly rare. Thomas never wondered whether he belonged in his village. He had been born there. His parents had been born there. His grandparents rested beneath the churchyard stones nearby. His identity was deeply connected to the land beneath his feet. Today, identity often feels more complicated. People move from city to city, change careers, join new communities, reinvent themselves multiple times throughout life. These opportunities can be exciting, but constant reinvention also demands constant adjustment. Thomas rarely questioned who he was. He was a farmer, a husband, a father, a son, a member of his village. Those simple answers gave his life remarkable clarity. As he filled the bucket from the cold stone well, he overheard two elderly women talking nearby. One spoke about preparing herbs for a neighbor who had caught a fever. The other mentioned that several families planned to repair the old wooden bridge before the next market day. No one waited for local authorities to organize everything. If something needed doing, the village often solved it together. That cooperation reduced more than physical labor. It reduced emotional burden. A problem shared among 20 families feels far smaller than a problem carried alone. Today, many people hesitate to ask neighbors for help. Some barely know the people living across the hallway. Modern independence has brought remarkable freedom, but it has also quietly increased isolation. Thomas returned home carrying the full bucket. Margaret smiled as she poured fresh water into a clay pot. Their youngest son followed behind, asking endless questions about birds, rabbits, and whether the clouds meant rain. Thomas answered each one patiently. There was no rush. Children in medieval villages spent much of their time beside adults. They learned by watching, helping, listening. Education happened naturally through daily life. There were no constant interruptions, no phones vibrating during conversations, no televisions pulling attention away from one another. Parents could focus on children because little else competed for their attention. Historians often describe medieval households as noisy places, not noisy with machines, noisy with people, grandparents, parents, children, neighbors stopping by unexpectedly, animals wandering close to the house, life unfolded together. That closeness sometimes caused arguments, but it also strengthened relationships. As Thomas and his family walked towards the fields, his father suddenly slowed. He bent down and picked up a tiny acorn lying beside the path. Holding it in his weathered hand, he smiled. "When I was your age," he said quietly, "my father planted the great oak near the stream." Thomas looked toward the enormous tree rising proudly above the fields. Its branches now stretched wider than the roof of any cottage in the village. His father continued. He knew he would never sit beneath its full shade. Thomas looked at the old man's wrinkled face. Then why did he plant it? His father gently rolled the acorn between his fingers. Because someone once planted trees for him? The words lingered in the cool morning air. Modern life often encourages immediate rewards, instant messages, instant deliveries, instant entertainment, instant success. Medieval people understood something different. Some of life's greatest achievements would never be seen by the person who began them. Cathedrals took generations to complete. Fruit trees needed years before bearing harvests. Families built homes intended for grandchildren not yet born. Thinking beyond one's own lifetime created a remarkable sense of purpose. Stress often grows when everything feels urgent, when every goal must be achieved immediately. Thomas's world moved more slowly. His ambition stretched across generations rather than months. As they reached the fields, the clouds William had predicted yesterday finally arrived. A cool breeze swept across the valley. The smell of approaching rain filled the air. farmers looked upward. No one complained. No one cursed the weather. Rain was neither good nor bad by itself. It simply belonged to the natural rhythm of life. Modern people often become frustrated by events beyond their control. Traffic, weather, delayed flights, slow internet, unexpected changes. The medieval villager learned early that resisting reality accomplished very little. Acceptance was not surrender. It was wisdom earned through experience. The first raindrops landed softly on the soil. Thomas smiled. The barley needed this. He removed his cap, lifted his face toward the gray sky, and allowed the cool rain to wash away the dust covering his forehead. For a few quiet moments, every farmer in the valley stopped working. No one spoke. They simply stood together, watching life return to the earth. Centuries later, scientists would discover that spending time in nature lowers stress hormones, steadies the heart, and calms the nervous system. Thomas knew none of that. He simply knew that after the rain came, the fields always smelled sweeter. Sometimes history's greatest lessons were never written in books. They were carried by the wind, hidden inside the rhythm of the seasons, and quietly remembered by ordinary people who never imagined the modern world waiting centuries ahead, a life without endless comparison. The rain lasted only a short while. By midday, the gray clouds had drifted eastward, leaving behind a fresh scent of wet earth that spread across the valley. Tiny drops of water still clung to the barley, sparkling whenever sunlight slipped through the clouds. Thomas rested his hoe against a wooden fence and looked across the fields. Everything seemed brighter after the rain. The grass looked greener, the sky appeared deeper, even the air felt cleaner. He took a slow, deep breath without thinking about it. For him, this was simply another ordinary afternoon. For a modern visitor, it might have felt like stepping into another world. Not because medieval people lived in luxury, far from it, but because their minds were rarely bombarded by constant comparison. Today, comparison follows people almost everywhere. A few moments spent on social media can expose someone to hundreds of carefully selected images of success. Larger homes, expensive vacations, perfect families, successful careers, luxury cars, beautiful meals, smiling faces. The human brain naturally compares. It always has. But for most of history, comparison had limits. Thomas compared himself to people he actually knew. William owned 2 oxen, Thomas owned 1. Old Robert's harvest had been better last year. The miller's son had recently built a larger barn. These comparisons were real, but they remained local. No one in the village knew how kings lived every single day. No one constantly measured their lives against wealthy merchants living hundreds of miles away. The distance between social classes existed, yet ordinary villagers rarely witnessed it. That made a tremendous psychological difference. As Thomas continued repairing a section of fencing, his younger brother Matthew arrived carrying a bundle of freshly cut branches. "You'll need these," he said. Thomas smiled. "You always know when I'm running short." Matthew shrugged. "I noticed yesterday." No payment was expected, no written agreement, no contract. Families simply helped one another. Sometimes neighbors exchanged labor instead of money. One week, several men might gather to repair a roof. The next week, everyone helped another family bring in their harvest before a storm. This system had existed for generations. Life demanded cooperation. Historians sometimes call this a gift economy in rural communities, not because everything was free, but because favors, trust, and shared responsibility often mattered more than coins. Modern economies have created extraordinary wealth. Yet they have also turned many everyday interactions into transactions. Need help moving furniture? Hire someone. Need food? Order it. Need company? Schedule it. Medieval villagers often solved problems together before thinking about payment. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas and Matthew worked side by side. The rhythm of hammering wooden stakes into the soft ground became almost hypnotic. Strike, lift, adjust, strike again. There was no pressure to multitask. Thomas wasn't trying to answer messages while repairing the fence. He wasn't listening to breaking news. He wasn't switching between 10 different responsibilities every few minutes. His attention belonged entirely to one task. Modern neuroscience suggests that the human brain performs better when focused on a single activity. Constant interruptions increase mental fatigue. Yet interruptions have become one of the defining features of modern life. Thomas rarely experienced them. His work required complete presence, and complete presence often brings unexpected peace. By late afternoon, the village road became busier. A small group of merchants approached with 2 wagons pulled by sturdy horses. Children immediately ran towards the road, eager to see what had arrived from distant towns. Merchants were among the few people who carried stories from the wider world. They spoke of castles, markets, roads, strange customs, occasionally even distant wars. The entire village gathered to listen. Not because news arrived every minute, because news arrived rarely. Every story felt valuable. Today, information has become so abundant that people often stop appreciating it. Thousands of headlines compete for attention every day. Many are forgotten within hours. For Thomas, a single traveler might provide enough stories to discuss for weeks. Information moved slowly. So did opinions. There was time to reflect. Time to question. Time to remember. One merchant described a magnificent cathedral rising in a city several days away. Its stone towers, he claimed, reached toward heaven itself. The villagers listened in amazement. Few of them would ever see it. Yet simply imagining such a place filled the evening with wonder. Thomas realized something. He didn't feel jealous. He felt curious. Modern comparison often asks, "Why don't I have that?" The medieval imagination more often asked, "I wonder what that must be like." Curiosity brings energy. Envy drains it. As sunset approached, the merchants continued their journey, disappearing beyond the western hills. The village slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Children resumed their games. The blacksmith returned to his forge. Women carried baskets home from the communal oven. Life became ordinary again, and no one considered ordinary a failure. Perhaps that is one of the greatest differences between then and now. Modern culture constantly celebrates extraordinary lives, extraordinary success, extraordinary beauty, extraordinary wealth, extraordinary influence. The ordinary often feels invisible. Yet throughout most of human history, ordinary life was considered a blessing. An ordinary harvest meant food. An ordinary winter meant survival. An ordinary day meant that no one had died, no house had burned, and no sickness had entered the village. Ordinary meant peace. Thomas walked home beneath a sky painted with shades of orange and gold. His boots were heavy with mud. His shoulders ached. His hands were rough from years of labor. But his mind was quiet. He had spent the entire day working with people he trusted, speaking face to face, looking at fields instead of screens, measuring success not by wealth, but by whether his family would have enough to eat through the coming winter. Centuries later, many people would spend entire days surrounded by information, entertainment, and opportunity, yet finish each evening feeling strangely empty. Not because they lacked comfort, but because comfort alone has never guaranteed peace. As Thomas reached the cottage, his youngest son ran toward him once again, proudly holding a tiny wooden bird he had carved under his grandfather's guidance. The carving was uneven. One wing was larger than the other. The beak leaned slightly to one side. Thomas smiled as though it were the finest work he had ever seen. "You made this?" The boy nodded proudly. "Grandfather helped." Thomas placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Then we'll keep it forever." The little carving would never be sold. It held no great monetary value, but it carried something far more precious: time, love, memory. In the medieval world, many of the most valuable possessions could never be bought. And perhaps, without realizing it, that made people richer than they seemed. The village that carried everyone. The following morning began with a thick blanket of fog. From the doorway of his cottage, Thomas could barely see beyond the nearest oak tree. The familiar dirt road that wound through the village seemed to disappear into a sea of white. Everything felt quieter than usual. Even the birds sang more softly, as though they too were waiting for the mist to lift. Thomas pulled his wool cloak tighter around his shoulders and stepped outside with a basket of grain for the chickens. The damp grass soaked through his boots almost immediately. He smiled. It was going to be another ordinary day. For many modern people, the word ordinary sounds disappointing. For Thomas, it sounded reassuring. An ordinary day meant no fire, no invasion, no plague, no funeral bell echoing across the valley. Sometimes peace is simply the absence of disaster. As he scattered grain across the yard, the chickens rushed toward him in a noisy flutter of feathers. The youngest ones darted between the older birds, fighting over every tiny seed. Thomas laughed quietly. He had watched this same scene hundreds of times, yet it never seemed to grow old. Perhaps because life itself was slower. When the pace of life slows, people often begin noticing things they once ignored. The sound of rain against a roof, the smell of fresh bread, the shape of clouds drifting across the sky, the laughter of children chasing one another through muddy fields. Modern life moves so quickly that many beautiful moments pass unnoticed. The brain is busy thinking about what comes next, instead of experiencing what is happening now. After feeding the animals, Thomas walked toward the village square. The fog had begun to thin, revealing familiar figures emerging from the mist. Old Robert leaned against his walking stick. The baker carried warm loaves toward his shop. A shepherd guided his flock slowly through the narrow lane. Every face belonged. Every person had a place. The medieval village functioned almost like a living body. Each individual served a purpose. The blacksmith repaired tools. The miller ground grain. The carpenter built homes. The priest offered spiritual guidance. The shepherd protected livestock. The farmers fed everyone. No occupation seemed meaningless. Everyone understood why their work mattered. That sense of purpose quietly reduced another major source of modern stress. Today, many people struggle with a difficult question. Does my work really matter? They spend years performing tasks whose results feel distant or invisible. Thomas never asked himself that question. Every row he planted became food. Every repaired fence protected livestock. Every harvested bundle of grain helped his family survive another winter. The connection between effort and outcome remained clear. Humans often endure hardship surprisingly well when they understand why they're enduring it. As the fog continued lifting, the peaceful rhythm of the village was suddenly interrupted. A frightened boy came running down the road. "William!" he shouted between breaths. "William's horse has fallen." Without hesitation, nearly everyone stopped what they were doing. The baker set down his basket. The blacksmith wiped soot from his hands. 2 farmers abandoned their wagons. Thomas immediately followed the boy toward the western fields. No one asked whether helping fit into their schedule. No one wondered who would pay for their time. They simply ran. A short distance beyond the village, they found William kneeling beside his horse. The animal had slipped into a muddy ditch while pulling a cart loaded with timber. The cart lay tilted awkwardly. One wheel had cracked. The horse struggled desperately but could not free itself. William looked exhausted. "I've been trying for an hour." Thomas placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone anymore." Within minutes, nearly a dozen villagers had gathered. Some removed heavy logs from the cart. Others calmed the frightened horse. The strongest men tied thick ropes around the animal, while several women brought fresh water. Children carried smaller pieces of broken wood out of the way. Everyone found something useful to do. Finally, after one enormous effort, the horse climbed free. Covered in mud but unharmed, a cheer rose across the field. William laughed with relief. His eyes filled with tears. He looked around at the people surrounding him. "I don't know how to repay all of you." Old Robert smiled. "You already have." William looked confused. "When?" "When you helped rebuild my roof last autumn." Another farmer laughed. "And when you stayed all night with my family after my son became ill." The baker nodded. "And when you lent me your horse during harvest?" William slowly lowered his head. He realized something. This wasn't a debt. It was a lifetime of kindness returning to him. The medieval village rarely kept careful records of favors. People remembered instead. Trust became a kind of invisible wealth, perhaps richer than silver. Modern society often teaches independence as the highest goal. Solve your own problems. Earn your own success. Stand on your own feet. There is great value in independence. But human beings were never meant to carry every burden alone. For thousands of years, survival depended upon cooperation. The village understood something modern science now confirms. Strong communities protect not only the body, but also the mind. People facing hardship recover more quickly when surrounded by those they trust. Thomas watched William embrace his neighbors one by one. No speeches were given. No one expected praise. Helping simply felt natural. As everyone returned to their work, the mood of the village seemed lighter. Not because anything extraordinary had happened, but because everyone had witnessed something deeply reassuring. If misfortune came tomorrow, they would not face it alone. As the afternoon sun finally burned away the last traces of fog, Thomas resumed repairing his fence. Yet his thoughts lingered on the morning's events. He realized that wealth in the village was measured differently. Yes, some families owned larger fields. Some possessed stronger horses. Some harvested more grain. But when true hardship arrived, the richest person was often the one surrounded by the most helping hands. Centuries later, people would build towering cities, create astonishing technologies, and connect billions through invisible networks. Yet many would still whisper the same painful words. I have no one to call. Thomas could not have imagined such loneliness. In his world, even before asking for help, someone had usually already arrived. As evening settled over the valley, the repaired cart rolled slowly back toward the village. Children ran beside it laughing. William's horse walked calmly as though nothing had happened. The setting sun painted the fields with warm golden light. Thomas paused for a moment to watch the familiar scene, the cottages, the smoke rising from their chimneys, the church standing quietly at the center of it all, the people moving together like threads in the same piece of cloth. He smiled. Perhaps the greatest reason medieval people often carried less mental stress was not that life was easier. It wasn't. It was that they rarely carried life's weight by themselves. And sometimes, sharing a burden doesn't make the road shorter. It simply makes it easier to walk. Faith, hope, and the weight of uncertainty. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the valley, turning the morning mist into a soft blanket of gold. Thomas stood outside his cottage for a moment before beginning his work. The air felt unusually still. Not a single leaf moved. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual. He had learned long ago that nature often whispered before it spoke loudly. Somewhere beyond the distant hills, another storm was gathering. He could feel it. Not because he possessed any special gift, but because a lifetime spent outdoors had taught him to notice the smallest changes. The smell of the wind, the shape of the clouds, the unusual silence before rain. Modern people often trust weather forecasts. Thomas trusted the sky. He picked up his hoe and began walking toward the fields. Along the way, he passed the village church. Its stone walls had stood for generations. Some villagers believed the church had always been there, although everyone knew that wasn't true. Grandfathers told stories of the men who had hauled those heavy stones from the nearby quarry decades before. Many of those builders were now buried beneath simple crosses in the churchyard. Yet their work remained. Thomas paused for a moment. He wasn't in a hurry. The wooden door of the church stood open. Inside, candles flickered gently against rough stone walls. The air carried the scent of melted wax and old timber. Sunlight filtered through small colored windows, painting patches of red, blue, and gold across the worn floor. Only a handful of people were inside. An elderly widow quietly whispered prayers. A young mother held her sleeping child. The village priest knelt alone near the altar. No one spoke. There was no need. Silence itself seemed to belong inside these walls. For medieval people, faith was not something practiced only once each week. It shaped nearly every part of life. Birth, marriage, harvest, illness, death, the changing seasons. Even the ringing of the church bell divided the day. Whether one agrees with their beliefs or not, historians agree on one important fact. Religion offered medieval people a framework for understanding uncertainty. Modern science has answered countless questions our ancestors could never explain. Why lightning strikes, how diseases spread, why the planets move, how crops grow. Knowledge has transformed human civilization. Yet one question remains as difficult as ever. How should people live with uncertainty? Thomas had no control over tomorrow's weather. He had no power over illness. He could not guarantee that every harvest would succeed, but his faith taught him that not everything needed to be controlled. Some things needed to be accepted. This way of thinking reduced a kind of stress that many modern people know all too well: the desperate need to control every possible outcome. Today's world encourages planning. 5-year plans, retirement plans, career plans, investment plans, backup plans for the backup plans. Planning is valuable, but sometimes planning quietly becomes worrying. The mind begins trying to solve problems that do not yet exist. Thomas planned. He stored grain, he repaired his roof before winter, he sharpened his tools, but once those tasks were finished, he rarely spent endless hours imagining every possible disaster. There simply wasn't enough time. The fields demanded attention. The animals needed feeding. Life itself pulled him back into the present. As Thomas left the church, he noticed Father Edwin sweeping the stone steps. The old priest smiled warmly. "You seem thoughtful this morning." Thomas looked toward to the gray horizon. "I think another storm is coming." Father Edwin rested both hands upon the wooden broom. "Perhaps. And if it destroys the barley?" The priest looked across the valley before answering. "Then we plan again." Thomas frowned slightly. "It isn't always that simple." "No," Father Edwin agreed quietly. "It never is." For a moment neither man spoke. Finally the priest continued. "My father once told me something I never forgot." Thomas waited. "He said there are 2 kinds of burdens: the ones your hands can carry, and the ones only your mind keeps lifting." Thomas looked at him with curiosity. "If your fence breaks, repair it. If your roof leaks, mend it. If your neighbor is hungry, feed him." The priest gently leaned upon the broom. "But worrying about tomorrow's storm, while today's sky is still clear?" He smiled softly. "That burden grows heavier every hour you carry it." Thomas remained silent. The words settled somewhere deep inside him. Centuries later, psychologists would give names to this habit: anticipatory, anxiety, catastrophic thinking, rumination. The medieval priests simply called it carrying tomorrow before tomorrow arrived. Thomas thanked him and continued toward the fields. The village slowly came alive around him. Women opened wooden shutters. Children chased one another between cottages. The blacksmith's hammer rang rhythmically through the morning air. Everything appeared wonderfully ordinary. As the hours passed, dark clouds slowly gathered above the hills, exactly as Thomas had predicted. Farmers occasionally glanced upward. No one panicked. They simply continued working. When the first distant rumble of thunder echoed across the valley, William walked over carrying a bundle of wooden stakes. "Looks like we'll finish just in time." Thomas smiled. Hopefully. The 2 men worked faster. Not frantically, purposefully. There is a difference. Fear creates panic. Experience creates preparation. Medieval people understood storms because storms had always existed. Modern people often face different storms: economic uncertainty, constant information, digital overload, social comparison, career instability. Many of these dangers cannot be seen. That invisibility often makes them even harder to confront. By late afternoon, the wind had grown stronger. Trees bent gently beneath its force. Loose straw danced across the fields. The first heavy drops of rain struck the earth. Within moments, every farmer began gathering tools and covering supplies. Years of experience had taught them exactly what needed to be done. Nobody shouted. Nobody blamed anyone. Everyone simply moved together. Preparation replaced panic. As Thomas hurried home through the rain, he noticed something remarkable. Although the storm was loud, his mind remained quiet. He couldn't stop the rain. He couldn't command the wind, but he could protect his family. He could secure the animals. He could help his neighbors if needed. The rest belonged to forces far greater than himself. Perhaps this acceptance explains something historians sometimes overlook. Medieval people did not experience less hardship than we do. In many ways, they experienced more, but they often spent less energy fighting the unavoidable. Sometimes peace comes not from controlling life, but from knowing the difference between what can be changed and what must simply be faced together. The storm continued through the evening, shaking shutters and rattling rooftops across the village. Inside the cottages, families gathered close around warm fires. Outside, the wind howled across empty fields. Tomorrow would reveal what the storm had taken and what it had spared. When hardship was shared, fear became smaller. The storm raged throughout the night. Rain pounded against the thatched roofs with such force that it drowned out almost every other sound. The wind swept across the valley in powerful waves, bending ancient oaks that had stood for generations. Every now and then, a flash of lightning turned the entire village white for the briefest moment before darkness swallowed it once more. Inside the cottage, Thomas sat awake beside the dying fire. Not because he was afraid, because every farmer listened to storms. A lifetime spent working the land had taught him that the morning after a storm often mattered more than the storm itself. His youngest son stirred beneath a wool blanket. Margaret quietly pulled the blanket higher over the child's shoulders before returning to her place near the hearth. No words were needed. Both of them understood what tomorrow might bring. Not certainty, only possibility. Yet there was something remarkable about the silence inside the little cottage. It wasn't filled with panic. It wasn't filled with endless questions. No one imagined 100 different disasters before they had happened. The family simply waited. Sometimes waiting is all human beings can do. Modern life often convinces us that every uncertainty must be solved immediately. When uncertainty refuses to disappear, anxiety grows. The medieval world offered a different lesson. Some questions could only be answered by the sunrise. Long before dawn, the storm finally drifted eastward. Its thunder faded into the distance until only the steady dripping of water remained. Thomas opened the cottage door just as the first pale light appeared on the horizon. Cool air rushed inside. The village looked completely transformed. Leaves covered the roads. Small branches lay scattered across the fields. Water flowed through places that had been dry only yesterday. A section of old Robert's fence had collapsed. One of the baker's chimneys leaned dangerously to one side. Several fruit trees had lost large limbs. The storm had certainly left its mark. Thomas stepped outside. Within minutes, he noticed something familiar. People were already leaving their homes, not to complain, not to count their losses, to help. William was carrying spare timber toward Robert's farm before Robert had even asked. The blacksmith arrived with iron nails. The carpenter brought tools. Women carried baskets of food to families whose cooking fires had gone out during the storm. Teenagers gathered fallen branches into neat piles for firewood. Even children found ways to help, collecting scattered eggs from frightened hens that had escaped their coops. No one stood alone examining the damage. The village moved almost like one body. When one part suffered, the whole body responded. Historians often describe medieval villages as deeply interdependent. It wasn't simply an economic arrangement, it was emotional protection. People rarely had the luxury of believing that they could survive entirely on their own. As Thomas reached Robert's broken fence, the old man shook his head with a tired smile. I was wondering how I'd manage this. Thomas looked around. Nearly 10 neighbors had already arrived. I don't think you'll have to. Robert laughed. No, I don't suppose I will. Together they lifted the heavy posts back into place. The younger men dug new holes, while the older villagers measured each section carefully. Children carried smaller tools between the workers. Someone brought fresh bread. Another arrived with warm cider. The work continued through the morning, not as a burden, as a shared responsibility. No contracts, no invoices, no expectation of payment. Only the quiet understanding that someday the roles might be reversed. This way of life created something modern researchers frequently emphasize: resilience. Not because hardship disappeared, because hardship became collective. Modern stress often feels deeply personal. My bills, my career, my deadlines, my future, my problems. The language itself reveals isolation. Thomas thought differently. Our harvest, our village, our bridge, our church, our people. That single difference changed everything. Around midday, the repaired fence stood stronger than before. Robert leaned upon it proudly. It may last another 20 years. William laughed. Only if Thomas doesn't build the next one. Everyone burst into laughter. Thomas pretended to look offended. I'll remember that when your roof starts leaking. The laughter echoed across the fields. For a few moments, nobody worked. They simply enjoyed one another's company. Laughter has always existed. It doesn't belong to any century. But perhaps modern people underestimate how important shared laughter truly is. Today, entertainment often comes from watching strangers on a screen. The medieval villager found entertainment in one another. Stories, jokes, songs, friendly teasing. Community itself became the evening's amusement. As the afternoon sun dried the soaked fields, Thomas walked towards the stream. The water rushed faster than usual, carrying broken twigs and fallen leaves downstream. He sat upon a familiar stone, watching the current. His grandfather had once brought him here as a small boy. Now he often brought his own son. 3 generations had watched the same stream, the same valley, the same changing seasons. There was comfort in continuity. Modern life changes with astonishing speed. New technologies, new trends, new expectations, entire industries rise and disappear within a single lifetime. Change creates opportunity. But constant change also asks the human mind to adapt endlessly. Thomas's world certainly changed. Children grew, parents aged, kings came and went, harvests succeeded or failed. Yet the foundation of life remained remarkably steady. The same church bell, the same fields, the same footpaths, the same familiar faces. The mind often rests more easily when not everything is changing at once. As evening approached, Thomas noticed his eldest daughter walking beside him. She had been unusually quiet all day. Finally she spoke. "Father?" "Yes?" "Will there always be storms?" Thomas looked across the valley where the last dark clouds were disappearing beyond the hills. He smiled gently. "There always have been." She lowered her eyes. "Then, how do people stop being afraid?" Thomas thought for a long moment before answering. "I don't think we ever completely stop." She looked up at him. "We simply learn something more important." "What is that?" He watched William helping Robert stack the last pieces of timber while several neighbors shared bread beneath the old oak tree. Then he looked back at his daughter. "We learn that when the storm is over, we won't be standing here alone." She followed his gaze toward the villagers. A quiet smile appeared on her face. For perhaps the first time, she understood what her father meant. Courage isn't always the absence of fear. Sometimes courage is simply knowing that someone will be there to help you after the storm has passed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the village looked almost exactly as it had before the storm. Not because nothing had been damaged, but because many hands had repaired what one pair of hands never could. And perhaps that was one of the greatest secrets of medieval life. Their world was far from perfect, but their burdens were rarely carried in isolation. The gift of living at nature's pace. The storm had passed. By the following morning, the valley looked as though it had taken a long, refreshing breath. Sunlight spilled gently across the hills, and countless tiny drops of water still rested on every blade of grass. Birds, silent during the storm, now filled the air with cheerful songs as if celebrating the return of calm skies. Thomas stepped outside carrying a bundle of freshly repaired tools. The cool morning breeze brushed against his face. He stopped for a moment, not because he had forgotten something, not because he was late, simply because the sunrise was beautiful. Today, many people rarely witness the sunrise unless they are driving to work or glancing at it through a window. Their minds are already occupied by meetings, schedules, traffic, or the dozens of tasks waiting for them before noon. Thomas had work too, more than enough. Yet the first few moments of each day belonged to the world around him. He watched the golden light slowly creep across the fields. First the church tower, then the old oak beside the stream, then the rooftops of the cottages. Finally, the barley fields shimmered like waves of green glass. The valley awakened gradually. There was no sudden explosion of noise, no engines roaring to life, no constant vibration of machines. The loudest sound came from the distant crowing of a rooster. The medieval morning asked people to wake gently. Modern mornings often demand that people wake instantly. This difference may seem small, but human biology notices it. Scientists today understand that the body's internal clock, the circadian rhythm, is deeply connected to natural light. For thousands of years, people rose with the sun and rested after darkness fell. Thomas knew nothing about circadian rhythms. He simply followed the same rhythm that every generation before him had followed. His body rarely argued with the clock because the clock was the sun itself. As he walked toward the fields, he noticed several children chasing butterflies through the wildflowers growing beside the road. None of them carried toys. They didn't need them. The world itself became their playground. A smooth stone became treasure. A fallen branch became a knight's sword. A patch of mud became an entire kingdom. Modern childhood often happens indoors. Screens compete with trees. Algorithms compete with imagination. Thomas watched the children disappear into the meadow, laughing so loudly that even William looked up from his work and smiled. "Do you remember when we were that small?" William asked. Thomas laughed. "We probably caused just as much trouble." William nodded. "Perhaps even more." Both men laughed before returning to work. The conversation ended there. It didn't need to continue. Friendship often grows strongest in comfortable silence. Many modern conversations are interrupted every few minutes by ringing phones or buzzing notifications. Each interruption quietly reminds people that somewhere else might be more important than the person standing in front of them. Thomas and William gave each other something increasingly rare: their complete attention. As the hours passed, the rhythm of work settled naturally into the day. Dig, lift, carry, repair, rest, then begin again. The body understood the pattern. The mind wandered peacefully. Modern neuroscience has discovered that repetitive physical activities, walking, gardening, woodworking, farming, often calm the brain. Such tasks reduce mental noise and allow thoughts to settle naturally. For medieval people, these activities were not hobbies. They were daily life. Without realizing it, they spent hours engaged in work that gently balanced both body and mind. Around midday, Thomas paused beside the stream to drink. His reflection shimmered on the moving water. His face looked older than he remembered. The first strands of gray had begun appearing in his dark hair. He smiled. Growing older did not frighten him. Age carried respect in the village. The elderly were not seen as outdated. They were living libraries. Old Robert knew which herbs eased a fever. Thomas's father remembered the terrible winter from 40 years earlier and could predict how to prepare if another came. The oldest women remembered births, marriages, and family histories stretching back generations. Experience itself was valuable. Modern society often celebrates youth, speed, innovation, the newest idea, the newest device, the newest trend. The medieval village respected something different. Wisdom earned slowly. That respect gave older people purpose long after their strongest working years had passed. Purpose is one of the greatest protectors against despair. As afternoon drifted into evening, Father Edwin rang the church bell. Not because of danger, not because of tragedy, simply because tomorrow marked the feast of St. John. The annual celebration would begin at sunrise. Almost immediately, excitement spread throughout the village. Women began preparing extra bread. The brewer checked his barrels of ale. Children raced through the streets, unable to contain their excitement. Even the older villagers smiled more than usual. The feast happened every year. Everyone already knew what would happen. There would be music, dancing, shared meals, games, stories around large fires. Nothing surprising. And yet everyone eagerly anticipated it. Modern entertainment constantly seeks something new. A newer movie, a newer series, a newer trend. The medieval village found joy in traditions repeated for generations. Familiarity did not weaken happiness, it strengthened it. Traditions connected children to parents, parents to grandparents, grandparents to ancestors whose names had nearly faded from memory. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the western hills, Thomas carried the last bundle of tools back toward the cottage. The valley glowed beneath the soft colors of twilight. Smoke rose peacefully from every chimney. Someone nearby practiced a simple tune on a wooden flute. A dog barked happily as children chased one another through the village square. For a brief moment, Thomas stopped walking. He looked around carefully. The fields, the cottages, the church, the people laughing together. The old oak standing silently over the stream. Nothing about the scene appeared extraordinary, and perhaps that was exactly why it mattered. Human beings often spend so much time chasing extraordinary moments that they overlook the quiet beauty of ordinary ones. Thomas didn't believe happiness lived somewhere far away. He found it here, in familiar faces, shared work, simple meals, changing seasons, and evenings that always end beneath the same stars. Centuries later, countless people would search for peace in distant places, without realizing that peace sometimes begins by slowing down enough to notice what has been there all along. Tomorrow, the village would celebrate together. There would be laughter, music, old stories retold once again. And through those simple traditions, another invisible burden would quietly disappear. Because joy, when shared by an entire community, has a remarkable way of making even the hardest life feel lighter. The day the village forgot its worries, the morning of the feast arrived with a sky so clear that it seemed impossible the valley had endured a storm only a few days before. Long before sunrise, the church bell rang across the sleeping countryside. Its familiar voice drifted over the rooftops, through the orchards, and across the damp fields where a thin blanket of mist still rested. But this morning felt different. There was no rush toward the fields, no carts already creaking beneath heavy loads of hay, no farmers hurrying to finish chores before the heat of the day. Instead, people smiled as they stepped outside. Children were the first to notice. The youngest boy in Thomas's house jumped from his bed almost before the bell had finished ringing. "Is today the feast?" he asked excitedly. Thomas laughed. "It certainly is." The boy ran outside so quickly that Margaret had to remind him to put on his shoes. Across the village, the same excitement filled every home. For people in the modern world, holidays often come wrapped in stress: travel plans, crowded airports, shopping lists, expensive gifts, long traffic jams. The pressure to create the perfect celebration. Many people finish their holidays feeling more exhausted than before they began. The medieval feast was different. Its purpose wasn't to impress anyone. It wasn't measured by luxury. It wasn't photographed. It wasn't compared with celebrations in distant villages. It simply belonged to the people who gathered there. As Thomas walked toward the village square with his family, the transformation amazed him. Colorful ribbons hung from wooden poles, fresh flowers decorated doorways, long tables stretched across the open square. Women arranged warm loaves of bread beside wheels of cheese, roasted vegetables, smoked fish, honey, and baskets overflowing with apples. The smell of fresh baking mixed with wood smoke and cool morning air. It wasn't a royal banquet. It didn't need to be, because every family had contributed something. One household brought bread, another brought cider, the shepherd provided cheese, the beekeeper offered honey. The fisherman carried smoked trout wrapped carefully in cloth. No one expected one family to provide everything. Celebration itself became a shared responsibility. Modern celebrations often ask, What did I buy? The medieval feast asked, what did I bring? That small difference quietly strengthened the entire community. Thomas noticed old Robert sitting near the church steps. His walking stick rested against the bench beside him. Children gathered around as he began telling one of his favorite stories. It was a tale everyone had heard many times before. A brave knight, a mysterious forest, a dragon no one had ever truly seen. The children leaned forward as though hearing it for the very first time. Thomas smiled. Stories had always been humanity's oldest entertainment. Long before televisions, before cinemas, before streaming platforms, people gathered simply to listen. A skilled storyteller could hold an entire village silent, not with expensive special effects, only with words. Modern life provides endless entertainment. Yet many people rarely remember what they watched last week. The stories of Thomas's village survived for generations because they lived inside memory instead of machines. As the sun climbed higher, musicians arrived carrying simple instruments, wooden flutes, small drums, harps carefully crafted by hand. The first melody floated gently through the square. Within moments, several children began dancing. Soon the adults joined them. Thomas hesitated. Margaret smiled knowingly. You danced better when we were younger. Thomas laughed. I also had younger knees. She took his hand anyway. You'll survive. The music quickened. Laughter echoed across the square. Even old Robert tapped his foot against the ground in time with the rhythm. There were no professional performers, no audience separated from entertainers. Everyone participated. That was the point. Today, entertainment is often something people consume. The medieval feast invited everyone to create it together. Participation naturally creates belonging. Watching rarely does. As the afternoon continued, friendly competitions began. Children raced across the meadow. Young men tested their strength by lifting heavy stones. Women competed in baking contests judged by laughter as much as by taste. Archers lined up outside the village. To see who could strike the center of a straw target, Thomas watched his eldest son nervously prepare his first shot. The boy inhaled deeply, released the arrow. It landed far from the center. Several boys burst into laughter. For a brief moment, disappointment crossed his face. Then William walked over and gently adjusted the boy's stance. Try again. The second arrow landed much closer. The third struck the outer ring of the target. The villagers applauded. Not because he had won, because he had improved. Modern life often celebrates only victory. The medieval village celebrated effort. That difference shaped how people viewed themselves. Failure wasn't the end of the story. It was simply part of learning. As the afternoon sun warmed the valley, Father Edwin stood before the gathered villagers. He raised his hands. The conversation slowly faded. My friends, he began, another year has passed. He looked around at the familiar faces. We have buried some we loved. The crowd quietly lowered their heads. We have welcomed new children into our homes. Parents smiled. We have endured storms. Thomas glanced toward William. And we have gathered harvests. The priest paused. None of us reached this day alone. The entire village fell silent. His words were simple, yet every person understood them. Thomas looked around the square. There stood the blacksmith, who had repaired his broken plow without asking for payment. the widow who often watched children while their parents worked, the baker who always slipped an extra loaf into Robert's basket during hard winters, William, who had stood beside him through more seasons than either man could count. None of them truly lived alone. Perhaps that explained why joy felt so much larger when shared. As evening approached, enormous bonfires were lit around the edge of the meadow. Golden sparks drifted upward into the darkening sky like tiny stars searching for home. Families gathered around the fires. Songs echoed across the valley. Old stories returned once again. Children slowly grew sleepy in their parents' arms. Thomas sat beside Margaret, watching the flames dance against the night. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, she smiled. "It feels like yesterday." He nodded. "And somehow, it also feels like forever." She rested her head gently against his shoulder. Around them, laughter continued beneath the stars. No one checked the time. No one worried about tomorrow's work. For one precious evening, the village simply existed together. Centuries later, psychologists would write about the importance of rituals, shared celebrations, collective joy, and meaningful social connection. The people gathered around those fires needed no scientific explanation. They already understood something that modern society sometimes forgets. A community that laughs together can endure almost anything together. The flames continued burning long into the night, their warm light dancing across smiling faces. Tomorrow work would return. The fields would still need tending. The animals would still need feeding. Life would continue. But tonight belonged to something just as important, remembering that happiness grows strongest when it is shared. What the Middle Ages still whisper to us. The feast ended quietly. There were no fireworks lighting the sky, no grand farewell, no dramatic ending. One by one, the bonfires burned lower. Families gathered their blankets. Parents carried sleeping children home. Musicians packed away their simple instruments. The laughter slowly faded to the peaceful sounds of crickets and the gentle breeze moving through the fields. Thomas remained seated for a little while longer. The fire before him had become nothing more than glowing embers. He watched them carefully. Every flame, no matter how bright, eventually became a bed of warm coals. That was simply the way of things. Nothing lasted forever. Not celebrations, not storms, not sorrow, not joy. Perhaps that was one of the greatest lessons medieval people accepted far more easily than we often do. Everything has its season. He stood and began the slow walk home with Margaret and their children. The youngest boy had fallen asleep on his father's shoulder, completely unaware of the stars shining overhead. The road was quiet now. Only the sound of footsteps broke the silence. As they passed the old oak beside the stream, Thomas paused. The tree stood exactly where it always had. Its great branches stretched towards the heavens, unmoved by the worries of men. His father had once told him that his grandfather planted it knowing he would never enjoy its full shade. Now Thomas understood those words more deeply than ever. A meaningful life wasn't measured only by what someone gained. Sometimes it was measured by what they left behind. He gently touched the rough bark before continuing home, inside the cottage. The fire had nearly gone out. Margaret tucked the children into bed, Thomas's father quietly placed another piece of wood onto the glowing coals. For a few moments, the family simply sat together. Nobody reached for entertainment. Nobody felt uncomfortable with silence. The silence itself felt like home. Thomas looked around the small room. The walls were rough. The furniture was simple. The roof leaked during heavy storms. His hands were scarred from years of hard work. He owned very little. Yet he realized something that he had never spoken aloud. He had never spent his life chasing a version of himself that did not exist. He had simply tried to become a good husband, a dependable father, a loyal friend, an honest farmer, and somehow that had been enough. Outside, the wind moved softly through the barley fields. Tomorrow would look much like today. The sun would rise. The church bell would ring. The animals would need feeding. The soil would need tending. Children would laugh. Neighbors would greet one another. Life would continue. Not perfectly, but faithfully. As the fire slowly faded into darkness, imagine for a moment that the walls of Thomas's little cottage disappear. The centuries begin to move. Years become decades. Decades become centuries. Kings rise and fall. Castles crumble. Empires appear and vanish. Steam engines roar to life. Railways cross continents. Factories fill the skies with smoke. Electric lights replace candles. Telephones connect distant cities. Airplanes cross oceans. Computers shrink into pockets. The internet wraps itself around the world. Humanity lands on the moon. Artificial intelligence begins helping people write, learn, and create. Civilization accomplishes wonders that Thomas could never have imagined. Diseases that once terrified entire villages become treatable. Travel that once required months takes only hours. Knowledge once locked inside monasteries becomes available to billions of people. Life becomes safer, longer, more comfortable, and yet, somewhere in a brightly lit apartment, a young professional lies awake at 2 o'clock in the morning. The room is warm. The refrigerator is full. The doors are locked. The city outside is peaceful. Nothing is physically threatening them. Yet sleep refuses to come. Their mind races work tomorrow. Bills. Messages left unanswered. News from across the world. A photograph showing someone else's perfect vacation. A promotion someone else received. A future that feels uncertain. 1,000 invisible burdens. Thomas would have struggled to understand such a night. Not because his life lacked hardship, but because his hardships usually stood in front of him. He could see them, touch them, work on them. Many of ours live inside our minds. History is often told as the story of progress, and in countless ways that story is true. We live longer, we know more, we have opportunities our ancestors never dreamed possible. But history also reminds us that progress sometimes asks for unexpected payment. The Middle Ages were not a golden age. People suffered from disease. Many children never reached adulthood. War could destroy generations. Justice was often harsh. Poverty was common. No honest historian would pretend otherwise. We should never romanticize their struggles. But we should not ignore their wisdom either. They understood that people need one another. They understood that work ends when the sun goes down. They understood that celebrations matter, that traditions hold communities together, that children belong outside beneath open skies, that meals taste better when shared, that neighbors are worth knowing, that not every moment must be productive, that not every silence must be filled, that not every problem can be solved today. Most importantly, they understood that life was never meant to be lived alone. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden inside medieval villages has nothing to do with castles or kings. It has everything to do with being human. The human heart has changed far less than our technology. It still longs for belonging, for purpose, for meaningful work, for quiet evenings, for familiar faces, for laughter around a shared table, for someone who will arrive without being asked when the storm has passed. As dawn broke over the valley once more, Thomas stepped outside his cottage, exactly as he had done thousands of mornings before. He looked across the fields. The barley swayed gently in the morning breeze. Children's laughter echoed somewhere beyond the stream. William raised a hand from the neighboring field. Thomas smiled and waved back. Nothing about the moment would ever be recorded in a history book. No king would hear about it. No chronicler would write it down. No monument would be built to remember it. And yet, perhaps this ordinary morning contained a kind of wealth that cannot be counted in coins, a wealth measured in peace, in friendship, in purpose, in enough. The church bell rang once again. Thomas picked up his worn wooden hoe. Another ordinary day had begun. And perhaps, after everything history has taught us, the greatest secret isn't that medieval people had less stress because their lives were easier. It's that they knew something many of us are still trying to remember. A good life is not built by having everything. It is built by knowing what is already enough. The bell echoed across the valley one final time. The sun climbed above the hills. The fields awakened. And the story quietly returned to where it had always belonged. Not in the castles of kings, but in the ordinary lives of people who, despite all their hardships, never stopped finding reasons to greet another sunrise,